Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Pamela Jeffrey. I'm founder of the Prosperity Project, and it's my pleasure to host our virtual launch event today to discuss the findings of our 2022 annual report card on gender diversity and leadership, the Zero Report. Before we begin, I'd just like to express my sincere thanks to our 2022 annual report card presenting sponsor, KPMG in Canada, our collaboration partner, WCM, our co-presenting partner, BMO Financial Group, together with AGF Investments, CPP Investments, Franco-Nevada, NEO, RBC, and TELUS. So for those of you who are new to the Prosperity Project, let's just tell you a little bit about it. We are right across the country, volunteer-driven, now a registered charity. And we're working to explicitly link women in prosperity to underscore the economic importance of gender equality. And we started all this in April of 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning, out of concern that it would have a disproportionate impact on women. So we began to build a community. And we started with our 62 founding visionaries and 38 visionaries now who have joined them, our 22 founding partners and sponsors, 12 founding believers and corporate members, and about 600 amazing volunteers who are driving our 5 initiatives. And from the very beginning, we've applied an intersectional identities lens to everything that we do. And so, like ourselves, as the founding visionaries and visionaries, we are looking to ensure that those who are members of underrepresented groups, people of color, Indigenous, Black, persons with disabilities, and are members of the LGBTQ2S community are front and center in all that we do. And so I'd like to acknowledge that no matter where you're joining us from today, we're all located on the traditional territories of the many diverse Indigenous peoples. We honor the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and we honor them and thank them for the privilege of living and working on their lands. And thank you to founding visionary, Roberta Jameson, a First Nation woman herself, for our land acknowledgement. So let's look at the results of our 2022 annual report card. This is the group of 62 women who came together. We created a 5-point plan, and the annual report card is one of our 5 initiatives. We have a growing group of partners and sponsors, as mentioned. Thank you to KPMG, our presenting sponsor, WCM, our collaboration partner, as well as BMO, our co-presenting partner, together with AGF Investments, CPP Investments, Franco-Nevada, NEO, RBC, and TELUS. We couldn't have done this research without an amazing group of organizations, and we applaud these 82 who stepped up, and we're applauding you for your leadership and commitment to transparency and the setting of a baseline. Without a baseline in order to measure progress, we're never going to see the kind of change that we would all like to see. And that is change that sees gender parity at the leadership levels of our country's largest organizations. Not only gender parity, but racial diversity that reflects who Canada is today. So for the second year in a row, this is groundbreaking research. This year, we added a 4th level. So our research covers board, executive officers, senior management, and pipeline to senior management, right across the economy in some of Canada's largest organizations. Thanks to the 82 and their women who agreed to self-identify, we are presenting today data on over 21,000 women who are in leadership roles who also identify as white, women of color, Indigenous, Black, living with disabilities, and new this year, LGBTQ2S+. And it's a snapshot as of 2021, the end of September, what women's representation looks like. So it is a new standard because we are looking at 4 leadership levels. Typically, research looks at board and executive levels only. We've got some really interesting findings for you from a really diverse group of well-respected organizations in sectors including banking and insurance, mining, oil and gas, manufacturing, transportation, construction, retail, utilities, real estate, and telecoms. Pretty comprehensive look at the Canadian economy. And a big thanks to the Prosperity Project's data and analytics partner, KPMG in Canada. So what did we find? Okay, to start off, going to look at women's representation at the board table, which within this group of organizations, women hold about 1/3 of board seats. And they hold just under 30% of executive officer seats. And so those figures are in sharp contrast to the average of public companies, which, according to the disclosure made in July of last year, 23.4% of public companies' board seats are held by women, and only 18.2% of executive officer roles. So clearly, this group of 82 organizations is leading the way. Next, we looked at senior management roles and the pipeline to senior management roles. And what's really encouraging here is that we have over 40% of senior management roles held by women and almost 55% of the pipeline to senior management roles held by women. And so that meets our definition of gender parity, which is between 40 and 60%. So let's dive a little deeper now into the findings, looking at women's representation by organization type. So here you'll see that our quantitative analysis shows that within 2 of the 4 groupings, gender parity has been achieved at 3 of the 4 leadership levels. What I'd like to ask you to do is look at Crown corporations to start. So they have achieved gender parity, this group, at the board, senior management, and pipeline to senior management levels, not yet at executive officer roles. And then on the far right, you'll see a grouping of Canadian subsidiaries of foreign-owned corporations, along with a few cooperatives. And you'll see here that they too have reached gender parity at 3 of the 4 levels: board, senior management, and pipeline to senior management. Moving to public companies have achieved, if you look at senior management roles and pipeline to senior management roles, they have achieved gender parity at those 2 levels. And they are ahead with respect to representation at those 2 levels of private companies. Next is women's representation by industry. So here you'll see a breakdown. This is representative of the groupings of the companies, and you'll see finance and insurance. If you look at the 4th column, you'll see finance and insurance is leading the way. They've achieved gender parity at all 4 levels. Retail is closely behind. You'll see that what we find interesting is that going back to finance and insurance, senior management roles are held 43% of them by women, 41% executive officer roles. So typically that gap is quite a bit larger, but in this sector, it's been reduced to just 2%. That's in contrast, if you scan, to other sectors where the proverbial glass ceiling seems to be one that is still in place. And so you'll see a bigger percentage point gap between senior management roles and that higher level at the executive table. So let's now look at intersectionalities. So what you're looking at here is an overall representation summary across the 4 levels: board, executive officers, senior management, and pipeline. And in the left graph, you'll see that women of color represent 6.2%. So they hold, of all those roles in all the companies, 6.2% of those roles are held by women of color. and 0.5% are held by Black women, bringing us to a total of 6.7% overall representation of racialized women. Women overall hold 31% of those roles at the 4 levels. If you look at this graph on the right, we're looking at Indigenous women. And the findings of the report identify a serious underrepresentation among women with intersecting identities. So Indigenous women, together with the women on our next slide, women with disabilities, and LGBTQ2S women on our next slide, they each hold less than 1% of senior management and of senior leadership and pipeline positions, respectively. Less than 1%. So we dive a little more deeply into our findings. We've broken it down so that you can see, for example, racialized women who hold in the top left graph 4.9% of the 34.2% of board seats that are held by women. Drops in executive officer roles to 3.7, jumps up to senior management roles 7.9%, and drops down to 6.7%. We're going to pause here because for the status quo to change, to see greater representation in senior management and executive officer roles, the pipeline needs to be much more robust. And a pipeline with 6.7%, which is lower than the 7.9% in senior management, is not going to get us there. Representation of Black women across roles is similar. And again, similar with women of color across roles, where the pipeline is not as strong as the representation at senior management. Next slide. Same for Indigenous women, same for LGBTQS, and same for women living with disabilities. I encourage you to read the annual report card when you have a moment so that you can digest what we're sharing today. Percentage with at least one identity. So what you're looking at here, and I'll help you decipher it, is you're looking at organizations that reported having at least one of these individuals in these groupings at a level. So for example, board roles, looking at Indigenous women, 6.1% of organizations have at least one Indigenous woman at the board level. 2.4% have at least one woman at the executive officer level. 12.2% have at least one Indigenous woman at senior management, and so on. So you see that the pipeline to senior management roles in the far right column, women of color, almost 76% of organizations have at least one woman of color in the pipeline to senior management, which means 24% do not. Similarly, Black women, with 39% having at least one, meaning 61% of organizations do not have one. Next, thank you very much for allowing us to present very quickly those key findings. You'll find them in a very comprehensive report. And again, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to kick off now with our roundtable. And I'd like to introduce our speakers. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us Vanessa Leverance, who is Chief Inclusion Officer, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at BMO Financial Group. Patrice Walsh-Watson, Senior Managing Director, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary at CPP Investments. Paul Brink, President and CEO, Franco Nevada. Matthew LaBerge, Partner and Regional Leader, Economics and Policy Practice, KPMG in Canada. Joss Schmidt, co-founder and CEO, Neil. Gopal Bansal, Vice President, Diversity and Inclusion, Royal Bank of Canada. Jill Schnarr, Chief Social Innovation and Communications Officer, TELUS. And Katie Squires-Thompson, Chief Strategy Officer, WCM, Women in Capital Markets. Delighted that Joss and Katie will be co-moderating today's roundtable to talk on how to increase women's representation and apply an intersectional identities lens to succession planning to increase diversity at the leadership level. During the discussion, we encourage you to type any questions you have into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel, and you can upvote questions that others have asked. Okay, Josh and Katie, take it away.
Thank you, Pamela. It's wonderful to see the 2022 annual report card. It really is the product of incredible collaboration between organizations as we journey towards greater diversity in leadership. So the report shows that at the very top, women represent roughly 1/3 of corporate director roles at 34%, and slightly less than 1/3 of executive officer roles at 29%. We know this group of 82 participating organizations are leading the way, and they're well ahead of others. So as Pamela showed in her opening remarks, comparing it to the TSX listed companies, representation for these 82 organizations is higher at these levels. So the efforts that they're making are translating into progress and results. So let's hear what they're doing. Paul, can we start with you? What are 3 actions Franco-Nevada is taking to move the dial?
Eddie, I think it's important to try and take action across the spectrum. Starting from the top, we had a couple of years ago set the objective of 30% women director on our board. We've achieved that, and so have now reset that objective. Our new objective is 40% overall diversity amongst the board and senior management. So one, setting the objective. Second is on hiring. And we have, in all our hiring processes now, said for every position that we hire for, we have to identify female candidates and make sure that they're included in the process. So making sure that we go that extra mile to find all the good candidates that we can. And the third is our industry is the mining industry. There hasn't been a lot of female participating in the past. That is improving immensely. But encouraging people in the industry. And so we have started a scholarship program, a diversity scholarship program, trying to attract more diverse candidates in the industry.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And Jill, what about you at TELUS?
Hello. Well, I would say as a global employer and one of the largest employers in Canada, we really have a responsibility to be at the forefront of addressing gender equality and ensuring that we actually reflect the diversity of our team and our communities. So first, we're making very bold commitments to ensure that women are represented at the leadership level. TELUS was one of the first Canadian publicly traded companies to actually adopt board targets. And we have targets that include gender, visible minority, and Indigenous representation. And I'm so excited to announce that we met and exceeded these targets this year. So currently our board composition is actually the forefront of corporate Canada. We have 6 women that sit on our board. That represents 45% of board members. So we're so close to 50%. We're almost there. And we also have representation of Black, Asian, and Indigenous directors as well. And they guide a lot of what we do at TELUS to ensure that we have better representation throughout all of our organization. Additionally, 40% of our executive leadership team is made up of women. And that's really important because when you have more women at the table, there's just a confidence and a credibility aspect that gets added to the mix. And women play really powerful roles at TELUS. I'd also say at the pipeline to senior management level, which is known as our Leadership Now program, we actually achieved gender parity back in 2019. And then in our 2021 cohort, we actually have women representing 55% of participants in the program. And I always say as women, if we're just trying to achieve gender parity, we're actually being under ambitious. So that's the first thing that we're doing. Secondly, we're always creating a great environment to support and uplift women. So we have our women's network, which provides, mentorship and training opportunities. We're constantly investing in education and training programs for all of TELUS. So, we have programs like addressing unconscious bias, to respectful workplace training. And these are really important because I think those biases still exist, even though we think we are not biased. Many of us still are, and we have to bring that out to the forefront. And then finally, even before COVID, we were encouraging and supporting people, both men and women, to work full-time from home. And this work from home program has really been a major differentiator for us as an employer. It gives our teams the flexibility to work when and where they're most effective. They don't feel the pressure to come into the office. I mean, we're a national, in some cases, international company anyway. But, I have team members all across the country. We didn't skip a beat when we all had to start working from home. And in fact, we immediately enabled 95% of all of our teams across the country to work from home. We had all of our call center folks also working from home because we've got this great technology, right? We can send all of the calls from the call center to that rep's office at home. It's amazing what technology has enabled us to do. And so, even when our offices begin to reopen later this year, we anticipate that 90% or more of our team members will continue to work virtually, maybe only coming into the office, 1, 2, or 3 days a week. So this is an incredible benefit and a differentiator for women, especially because we have to shoulder the majority of care, for at-home care. And so it just gives us so much more flexibility. And then third, I'd say, we have to really lift women up and give them exposure and recognize them for their leadership and efforts. And so we have leadership and recognition programs specifically targeting women and people that support diversity across the organization. And that's done an amazing job to really expose some of these fantastic women that have moved into bigger leadership roles as a result.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. Exactly. The targets and the goals are just the vision, right? The starting point. And then you need all the tactics and processes in place to make sure that you can get there. Thank you for sharing all that about what you're doing at TELUS there. And so if we look 2 levels below the director and executive officer role, here women represent a little bit higher. So 41% of senior management roles and slightly more than half of pipeline to senior management roles at 54%. So the report defines gender parity as between 40 and 60% of either gender. And so the good news is that this group of 82 organizations has achieved gender parity at these 2 levels. So the question becomes, what can organizations do to retain women in the pipeline so that this gender parity translates up to the executive teams and boards of directors? Vanessa, why don't we start with you and hear your thoughts on that?
Well, thanks, Katie. And I think Jill touched on a lot of the topics that I would recommend from retaining our women at the pipeline. A lot of it is around, it's not just development, it's mentoring and sponsorship across the organization, equipping leaders to recognize high potential women and providing those opportunities. Reviewing policies. I think Jill had mentioned about essentially work-life balance, family programs to really support that. Look at some of our leave programs as well as an opportunity to create a differentiated experience for the pipeline. Equipping our leaders to understand the pipeline, understand the talent in our pipeline. And an interesting concept that a lot of us have been talking about are talking to our pipeline. Why are they staying? What are their aspirations? And how can we build programs to identify blind spots from a gender bias perspective? And Jill had mentioned that as well. So I think what we're doing at the senior levels, proliferate that down into our pipeline levels as well, and really showcasing our talent and providing those opportunities to meet with senior leaders to build their skill sets and their competencies and their capabilities for this high potential talent. And I think that's a really great starting point to really understand our pipeline, to retain our pipeline of women of any identity to move them through the organization and develop into leaders of the future.
Thanks, Vanessa. I love your point about talking to your pipeline, which is, I think, the shift in the right direction as to previously, telling people what to do. You're asking, what do you need to succeed? How can we make this better for you? So that's really important. Paul, anything to add?
I think both my comments here will echo things that have been said. And the first, just in terms of COVID and work from home and what we've learned from that, and how actually allowing that work flexibility can make people more productive and also allow them to fit all their life obligations together. As we're moving people back into the office and having discussions with women in our workforce, very often they are saying to us that that flexibility makes it so much more possible for them to do what they need to do. And so I think, in retrospect, we're going to look at COVID as a huge opportunity in terms of how we think about our workplace and the opportunity in particular for women in terms of managing the work-life balance and participating in the workplace. And the second echoes Vanessa's comments. We had set up a diversity council really to get feedback from our employees to say, what is it that we can do about our workplace that will make it easier for you to do your job each day when you're in the office, or both within the office and out of the office? And they've come up with a number of good recommendations and some things, the sort of things that I wouldn't have thought of. And one of them was, we've got a number of women with young kids who said, if we need to collect milk through the day, there's no place for us to do it in the office. Can we have a space where we can do that in the office? So we're working on putting that space. But it's on that same theme of listening to folks and trying to do what we can to make the workplace as accommodating for them as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Jill, how about you?
Yeah, I think just to add, I think, there's two really critical steps. I think the first is to really understand through data and measurement, which is a lot of what the report is recommending, what the gender discrepancies actually are at your organization, because there's great representation of women in particular areas, and then underrepresentation in other areas. And so we've done really extensive data analysis on women's careers at TELUS, and we were able to look by business area and really clearly identify specific job areas we need to focus on. Women have a high representation in communications and human resources, but not so much in some of our tech roles. And so, we took then the second step, and we created specific measurable goals into our business model so that we could address the pocket areas where we didn't have enough female representation. So, we found out we weren't recruiting enough women into tech roles at TELUS. It was actually less than 10%. And we examined, okay, well, why is that? So we actually focused on increasing the number of female candidates applying. We adjusted the structure of the role to ensure it appealed, more to women. We neutralized language in job postings. We ensured that 50% of all interviewed candidates were women. And that's really, really important, because a lot of people will say, oh, well, we can't find enough female candidates. I actually think that's untrue. I just don't think we're interviewing enough. And so by doing that, we actually increased our tech representation up to 30%. It's still not 50. We still have some work to do. But I think it's a good focus area. You have to really focus on the problem areas in your company based on data, and then set really clear, measurable goals to try to address it and fix it.
And sorry, Katie, can I just add one thing? Jill had mentioned something about sort of the sort of diversity of slates and women applying. But I think we have an opportunity to open the aperture a bit on where we're recruiting. And I love your comment, Jill, about the neutrality in job postings. Not so masculine, the wording and those kind of things, or biased in the language that is used, because that can be a big deterrent. But for me, it's really opening the aperture on where we are sourcing our talent as well, women talent, and on an intersectional basis as well. So Jill, I just had to mention that because it flagged me that this is a critical piece as well.
Thanks for adding that, Vanessa.
Thank you, Katie. And I see we already have a great discussion, a lot of input taking place. And I would like maybe to take this opportunity to pinpoint to the Q&A session again. So please put your questions in there. And the first one that I see from Deneen Das, I probably will take that and refer both to the report as Pamela has presented it, but also in the discussion. I think the word female candidate is definitely to be understood with its intersectional component to it. I think that's clearly how everyone thinks about it, and the questions that are going to follow now are definitely going to give you some additional light and color with respect to that element of focus. So the next question is about self-identification. It's one of the topics that we hear a lot about when we look at diversity. And the question is, how can organizations use that data to increase diversity in leadership roles and in the pipeline to those leadership roles? Mathieu, can we start with you to get your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so in terms of self-identification data collected to increase diversity in leadership, I think in the pipeline role, it's important, to put those data in place, in the sense that something that you actually don't measure is not really something that you can actually address and move forward to. In terms of the barriers that the different organization can face with regards to increasing representation, I think what's really important here is the notion of unconscious bias, and it ties back to the notion of how can we use self-identification data? And I know that that's a question that will be coming later, but self-identification data is really important in the sense of it removes some of the homogeneity of groups that may not have as much consciousness around their unknowns because of their homogeneity, and having difficulties to identify what are the unconscious buy-in within the organization. Interestingly enough, it speaks a lot to the need for increased diversity and the need for making those identification data and those barriers go down by, having, for example, organizational mechanism. One that's more recently put in place, for example, is the GBA plus framework, right? The organizations with strong GBA plus quantified modelizable GBA plus frameworks actually tend to have a better use of their internal data, have more open dialogue around what does that mean from an organizational perspective, and have less barriers into bringing people up and having a better overall representation of underrepresented groups. I think that also led, for example, in organizations I've worked with, to trying to tackle some of those unknown unknowns by having a focus on the lived experience of some groups. And what I have in mind in this sense, and that can foster empathy and understanding for Indigenous people, for example, is the blanket exercise, where people can actively relate to the history and understand what they couldn't probably see before because of their unknown unconscious biases. And I think that's the importance of self-identification data in removing barriers is exactly that. It puts a spotlight on things that we as an homogeneous group in some organization cannot see otherwise.
Thank you, Mathieu, and sorry for putting you on the spot there. Just blame that on my eyesight. Patrice, can I get your thoughts?
Sure, Joss. I'm happy to add to what Matthew said. I think at CPP Investments, we think about it similarly to many of the organizations that have already had an opportunity to speak on this panel. But I'd start back a step by saying we really think that ensuring that there's a trustworthy mechanism that people can use to enter into this self-disclosure is really important. So we focus on ensuring that people are comfortable with the questions that we put forward on self-disclosure and are comfortable with the process and how the information will be used. And that really enables you to get good data, which is the baseline of what we've talked about in this work. And then once you have that data, we think about it in three ways. One is communication. So we've talked about, the adage of what information gets measured, gets acted on. And so if people understand this is data that you have and that you're interested in, it's obviously something people will see as important. And that's really supported by tone at the top, and all of the communications plans and development plans and training programs and other supports that get put in place. And being transparent about the results that you get is also important. So communication, both in terms of it's important, and secondly, here's the data we got, and sharing it broadly so that people can understand where we're at as an organization. Secondly, then discovery, and Matthew talked about it, kind of the unknowns. So when you do the data analysis, you can really see what you're missing by intuition. And third, then action. And all of my fellow panelists who've already spoken have really talked about some of the actions that can be put in place, but really saying, here's the data, it's trustworthy, here's why it's important, we're sharing it with you so you can see it too, and then here's what we're going to do, how we're going to use it, and the really concrete steps we're going to take to make change so that we can ensure that the pool of talent available to us at CPP Investments is as broad as it possibly can be.
Thank you, Patrice, and thank you, Mathieu. I would say the only additional thought that I would maybe add that self-identification also does something else, which I think is very foundational to inclusion. It acknowledges diversity and it declares that we want to do something about it. And I think that is probably, a building block for everything else, and is going to help establishing the trust that is needed in these types of initiatives. Maybe I'm looking here at some of the questions that came in. With so few, let's take maybe this one, and I'm going to put it at maybe at you, Vanessa, if you don't mind. With so few Black and Indigenous women in Canada senior, oops, it just moved. There we go. With so few Black and Indigenous women in Canada's senior management corporate pipelines, what are organizations doing to inspire and or attract young Black and Indigenous girls and women through the education system? So this is more focusing on the education system. You maybe want to react to that one?
Actually, I was looking at that question too, Justice. Thanks for calling me on this. I actually think we all have a role to play at the youth level, whether it's high school or even at the university levels, from corporate Canada, to go in and talk about the opportunities, but have your leaders go in and talk to the students in order to understand this is what it's like to work in corporate Canada. These are the opportunities that are available there, and it's also an opportunity for your young talent, seasoned talent within your organization who reflect the communities that you want to build, to also build that bridge. So we're actively involved at the university and the high school level, and it's not just scholarships, but it's showing up mentorship, going in and talking at a conference. So they have a lot of student associations, getting involved that way through your internship programs that are focused. So if you have a dedicated internship program for Indigenous colleagues in tech or Black talent in tech, reach into those opportunities. The universities and the high schools that I've talked to are eager for that. And also it's having women, because we all have women in our organizations who are strong leaders and are developing and can represent your organization, and that these are opportunities in corporate Canada. So I think they're not just going to come to us. We need to go to them and meet them where they're at as well, and work with their professors and the student associations that they have across. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. We are doing that actively, as well as I know quite a few organizations on this panel are doing the same thing. That's what we need to do, and we need to do more of.
And I'll
Yep.
just
Thank
add,
you. Yep, sorry. I was going to say thank you, Vanessa, and I think showing success stories is very important also. But I would like to move to Gopal now. Gopal, let's come back to the organizations themselves, and Mathieu already touched a little bit on that earlier. But what are the barriers that you see when it comes to the representation of racialized and Indigenous men and women, I would say, or men and women with disabilities at the leadership level? So what are those barriers in your eyes, and how do you think we can overcome them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joss. Thank you. So I know Patrice and Mathieu talked about the data aspect of it, and that is foundational. So knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know is where you need to start. I also don't want to undersell this idea that simply because you collect data means that you have complete data. What's also important is, and Patrice touched on this, but ensuring that the people that work for you, that work in your organization, understand why you're collecting the data. For me, my first couple of years at RBC, I didn't go in and self-identify. And it's something that comes up when we get hired, until I had some conversations with now I understand. Okay, I get the value of this data, both for me and for the organization. And so that's the very sort of beginning of this. And then it's looking at the data from a lens of intersection. So, it's not enough to just look at, gender data and say, great, how is our pipeline looking? Where do we see gaps? Where do we see bottlenecks or opportunities? But also, what is the point of intersection? So if you're looking at it from a gender perspective, for example, great, we're seeing, women are doing well here. Well, is it all women? What is the intersection? What does that look like? What about Black women? What about Indigenous women? What about women from the LGBTQ+ community? What about women with disabilities? And recognizing that when you start to unpack that information is when you actually start to get into the insights that will enable you to identify what those barriers are in a more deliberate way and be able to take those actions you need to take, whatever they may be. In some cases, you may go in and find the barrier is institutional in nature. In other words, maybe the structure of how those roles have been created aren't conducive to the kind of flexibility that somebody might need in their life. Over the pandemic, one of the things that I have learned in many conversations is, for example, I've had conversations with colleagues with very visible disabilities and wheelchairs, and they have said to me, working from home, this is the first time I'm being seen for the value that I add, and not the disability first. And so recognizing that we need to challenge ourselves to say, great, how do we shift this then? How do we create opportunities for people with disabilities, for Indigenous people who have a strong connection to community and may want to work remotely? How do we create those opportunities and eliminate these barriers and structures that we may have inadvertently put in place? I think over the pandemic, everyone has learned a lot. And that's the good news. Now, I think it's just taking a harder look, diving deep into the information that you have, and then being transparent about it. Are you reporting to your workforce, as Patrice said, are you reporting out publicly on those points of intersection? What does that look like for your organization? What does a pipeline look like? What does senior management look like? What does executive representation look like? It's not enough, as we've seen in the report that just came out. It's not enough just to look at it from a gender lens and report, racialized groups separately, because you don't know what those points of intersection are. And so you need to think about the data, what it's going to inform you, but also recognize it may not be perfect. And so is it directional enough for you to be able to make the change that you need to make and address the barriers that you may see?
Thank you, Gopal.
One thing
Mathieu, sorry, go ahead, Gopal.
Sorry. The other thing that I will just add is being more deliberate on creating opportunities for people. I was going to raise this earlier when we were talking about sort of, the retention of women. I think it's also looking at the executive roles in an organization, saying what roles have led to these executive roles? What are people that are in those roles that have been successful? What path have they taken? What kind of experiences do we need? And then being very deliberate about creating those opportunities for groups that are underrepresented, whether they're points of intersection, whether they're not. It's just recognizing, great, we've got people in business roles. How do we give them profit and loss experience? How do we give them product experience? How do we give them marketing experience so that they can be successful in those executive roles and they can compete and build that set of skills that they need, to get into a leadership role, to get into a board role, whatever it may be.
Thank you, Gopal. Mathieu, any other thoughts you would like to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with everything Gopal said. One thing I want to emphasize is some of the barriers organizations were facing on top of, unconscious biases, as I mentioned, on top of, lack of good data and publicity around that data, as many people have mentioned, is that there were also some pre-pandemic, I would say, and I think the pandemic may have been an opportunity in that sense. Pre-pandemic, we used to have a lot of rigidity in the labor market, in the sense that, you have that concession, you have to show up to work, which means you're pretty much captive of the market, unless of a local labor market, unless you're, able to move, and not everyone is able to move. Now, I think that it had started before the pandemic. That has evolved much faster. The pandemic has actually accelerated the capacity to open up labor markets, right? I see more and more posting saying location anywhere in Canada. Well, if you don't find the opening in your market, then you have access to plenty of other markets that are already more diversified, more open. And I think that relates questions in the chat room as well around, how can we increase representation in lower representation industries such as mining and construction, and how can we tap in the pool of talent that the pandemic has most impacted, such as women and marginalized groups. Well, the working from home, the automation, the capacity, the digitalization of our economy is all an opportunity to increase representation and to break barriers that were existing on the labor market. So I just thought that was also a very interesting take, a glimpse of positivity in the in this ever-going pandemic, it seems.
Yeah, there is definitely, in a multitude of ways, a silver lining in it, and this is one of them, Mathieu, and you see that everywhere. We see that too in our organization. Katie, I think we're hitting the limits of the time allocated to the discussion. But I'm going to give it back to you to maybe take the lead on a couple of the questions that are coming from the audience.
Thanks, Joss. I'm actually going to give it back to Pamela to wrap up.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Katie, and thank you, Joss, for co-moderating. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just a quick thank you again to KPMG in Canada, to WCM, BMO Financial Group, and our other tremendous partners, AGF Investments, CPP Investments, Franco-Nevada, NEO, RBC, and TELUS. We hope you found today informative. I'd really encourage you to read the annual report card. It's chock full of really key insights that we hope will be useful to your organization. The Prosperity Project, we say, when women succeed, we all prosper. And we invite you to join us. Don't hesitate to send me an email. I'd love to get you involved with the Prosperity Project. Thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy.